After Earl Warren stepped down as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, he was replaced by Warren Earl Burger. Burger served as the 15th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court between 1969 to 1986. And prior to becoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger served on the District Court of Columbia Circuit. Before John Paul Stevens and Warren Burger would meet, Burger had already written a few landmark opinions and transformed how the court handled its business. One of these opinions was United States versus Nixon, when the court required President Nixon to produce tape recordings which contained evidence of criminal wrongdoing by the president and his men during the Watergate scandal. In this unanimous Supreme Court decision, all of the justices contributed to the opinion, and Chief Justice Burger delivered the unanimous decision. The court also rejected Nixon's claim to an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. This decision is important because it illustrated the integrity and independence of the court. Chief Justice Burger also wrote the majority opinion in another landmark case known as Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. This was another unanimous decision where the court ruled that busing students to different school districts in order to promote integration is constitutional. In later years, the court would lift this mandatory busing requirement, and today this is a decision that is by and large left to the city school board. During Burger's tenure as Chief Justice, the U.S. Supreme Court also ruled that a right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment extended to a woman's decision as to whether or not to have an abortion, in the landmark case that we know as Roe v. Wade. While Chief Justice Burger did not write the majority opinion in this case, he did vote with the majority in this decision. It might sound from the above cases as though Warren Burger was as liberal as his predecessor Earl Warren. However, this would be incorrect. Chief Justice Burger had conservative leanings and was considered to be a strict constructionist. Generally speaking, a strict constructionist emphasizes judicial restraint and tends to rely on the originally intended meaning of constitutions and laws. A strict constructionist generally does not approve of making a ruling which is based on either personal or political considerations. Burger was appointed by President Nixon. During his presidential campaign, Nixon promised to nominate law and order judges who would follow the law rather than engage in the kind of judicial activism that he ascribed to Earl Warren. And while Warren Burger was more conservative than his predecessor Earl Warren, it is fair to say that Burger was a moderate. As we will see later, Warren Burger was much more moderate than the future Chief Justice William Rehnquist. John Paul Stevens' real relationship with Chief Justice Warren Burger would begin around 1975 after Stevens was nominated to the Supreme Court. In his book, Stevens writes that Burger was quite friendly. Stevens also writes about the process by which he became a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. First, the President nominates a candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court, and then the Senate votes whether to confirm or to reject the nomination. If the candidate is confirmed, he or she is appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Stevens discusses the fact that various senators seem to be particularly concerned with his thoughts about the death penalty. Keep in mind that the death penalty had been found to be unconstitutional in the 1972 case Furman versus Georgia. So, when Stevens was being considered to be a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, many senators wanted to try and ascertain how he felt about capital punishment. During the confirmation process, Stevens did not shed much light on his opinion of the death penalty. However, shortly after he was appointed to the Supreme Court, Stevens would rule in favor of Gregg versus Georgia in 1976. This was the U.S. Supreme Court decision that essentially brought the death penalty back. In his book, Five Chiefs, Stephen writes that he deeply regrets his decision in the above case. Interestingly, according to Stevens, even though Chief Justice Warren Burger voted to uphold the constitutionality of the death penalty, he writes that Burger was also opposed to this as a matter of policy. It seems evident that Stevens respected Chief Justice Burger. He recognizes that Warren Burger's contributions to law have not been fully appreciated, and Stevens attributes this to the fact that Burger has many unfriendly critics, which may be in part due to the fact that he was involved in deciding controversial topics such as abortion and school busing. Stevens writes that Warren Burger was a great admirer of the fourth Chief Justice, John Marshall. Stevens writes that Burger was also an excellent presiding officer during oral arguments. Burger did not hesitate to allow a lawyer a few extra minutes here and there. This style is very different from William Rehnquist, who would become the next Chief Justice. During oral arguments, Rehnquist was noted for sticking to a very tight schedule, and he seldom granted a lawyer any more time once it had been exhausted. In 1986, after Warren Burger retired, President Ronald Reagan nominated William Rehnquist to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. William Rehnquist was already an associate Supreme Court Justice. Antonin Scalia was appointed by President Reagan to be an associate justice that would fill the seat vacated when Justice William Rehnquist was elevated to the Chief Justice. Whereas Rehnquist's confirmation was contentious, Scalia was asked few difficult questions by the Senate Judiciary Committee and faced no opposition. Scalia, who may be regarded as being one of the more controversial Supreme Court justices today, was ironically unanimously confirmed by the Senate and took his seat on September 26, 1986. In his memoir, Stevens recollects that Rehnquist was extremely concerned with efficiency and insisted that each justice speak only in turn during conference. Stevens notes that Rehnquist also kept to a strict schedule and did not like to devote more time on a topic once the allocated amount of time was exhausted. Chief Rehnquist also made sure that every oral argument ended on time. Rehnquist was very fair when it came to assigning which justice was to write an opinion. He assigned no justice, including himself, 2 opinions before everyone had been assigned at least 1 opinion, and he made no attempts to interfere with assignments for cases in which he was in the minority. In his book, Stevens also points to the fact that Rehnquist affixed 4 gold stripes on each sleeve of his robe. Any observer could tell that he held a unique position among the 9 U.S. Supreme Court justices. Stevens insinuates throughout his book that he looked down on this because the U.S. Supreme Court justice is supposed to be the first among equals. In his book, Stevens points out that when John Roberts replaced Rehnquist as Chief Justice in 2005, Roberts would not wear any type of decorative stripes on his robe. Stevens believes that this was much more appropriate for the Chief Justice to wear a robe which resembles the other justices. Throughout his career, Chief Justice Rehnquist consistently voted to uphold the death penalty. In Payne v. Tennessee, the court held that the prosecution could produce victim impact statements to support its request for the death penalty. Stevens dissented in this case, and he points out that only a few years before the Payne decision, the court squarely held that the admission of victim impact statements was impermissible. So, under the leadership of Chief Justice Rehnquist, the court seemed to flip-flop on this issue. During Rehnquist's tenure as Supreme Court Justice, the court would also invalidate 41 federal statutes, an unprecedented number. Chief Justice Rehnquist also led the court toward a more limited view of congressional power, and one of the Rehnquist court's major developments involved reinforcing and extending the doctrine of sovereign immunity, which limits the ability of Congress to subject non-consenting states to lawsuits by individual citizens seeking monetary damages. However, the court acknowledged that various amendments to the Constitution were intended to give Congress power to abrogate sovereign immunity, one of those amendments being the 14th, and thus Congress may authorize suits for monetary damages pursuant to, for example, its power to enforce the 14th Amendment, which includes the Equal Protection Clause. Next, Stevens turns to John Roberts, the 17th U.S. Supreme Court Justice, who succeeded William Rehnquist in 2005. John Paul Stevens, who was the most senior Supreme Court Justice, administered the oath of office to John Roberts in a ceremony at the White House. In his book, Stevens writes that he believed the ceremony should have taken place at the Supreme Court because of separation of powers. He notes that the two newest Supreme Court justices, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, were sworn in at the Supreme Court. In his book, Stevens writes that John Roberts is an excellent Chief Justice. He argues that Roberts is also a better presiding officer than William Rehnquist was. Stevens notes that the Roberts Court has been supportive of the death penalty. It enlarged the category of death-eligible offenses to include felony murder and has also authorized jury selection procedures that give prosecutors a better opportunity to impanel conviction-prone juries. Stevens notes that he dissented in both of these cases, but was outnumbered by his fellow justices. Roberts tends to be fairly conservative, which should not come as any surprise, as he was carefully vetted by the staff of President George W. Bush. But Chief Justice Roberts did give us at least one major surprise when on June 28, 2012, he delivered the majority opinion which upheld the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, and he did this there was a 5-4 vote. Sources say that Roberts switched his vote sometime after an initial vote was taken in the first deliberation among the Supreme Court justices. This landmark Supreme Court decision occurred long after Justice John Paul Stevens had retired from the bench. No one predicted that Chief Justice Roberts would vote the way he did. He is regarded as being one of the most conservative justices on the court, yet he voted with Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, who were all nominated by Democratic presidents. So why would one of the most conservative justices, who was appointed under George W. Bush, side with the most 4 liberal justices? This is the million-dollar question. And while there is no question that the former Justice John Paul Stevens respects John Roberts' ability as a Chief Justice, I think even he would be surprised by the way Roberts voted to uphold the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act.